Every week for 5 years, the same shot closed the opening titles. The Muppet Show logo lowers into place, the camera pushes in on the O, and a small blue creature appears to finish the job. In the very first season, he just hits it. One blunt strike like a gong with a different result every single time. From the second season on, something changes. He's still there in the O, but now he's got an actual instrument in his hands trying to land an actual note on a trumpet. It almost never works, but it's not a blunt object anymore. It's an attempt at music. Nobody watching at home in 1977 would have thought twice about that switch. It's a sight gag. But stretch it out across 5 decades and it starts to look like something else entirely. A tiny weekly record of a character quietly learning how to make a sound of his own. Some fans look at Gonzo's 50-year run and see a character getting smaller, simpler, louder in a safer, more predictable way. A sad little weirdo nobody understood turned into a daredevil with a chicken girlfriend and a trumpet that never works. Case closed, they say. Another character worn smooth by decades of writers reaching for the easiest joke instead of the honest one. But here's the detail that breaks that theory before it even gets going. Gonzo had one performer from 1976 until this year, 2026. The same man has had his hand inside that puppet. No recasting, no corporate handoff, no new actor bringing a new interpretation. Whatever happened to Gonzo over 50 years didn't happen because writers got lazy and reached for a shortcut. It happened because one person kept showing up decade after decade and kept changing. So if Gonzo changed, and he clearly did, the story isn't really about the puppet at all. 3 men, 1 puppet. Before there was a Gonzo, there was a henchman nobody was supposed to remember. 1970. A Christmas special called The Great Santa Claus Switch. A villain recruits a gang of monsters to kidnap Santa, and one of them pops out of a cigar box just long enough to hand his boss a cigar. That's the whole part. The puppet was called Snarl, and the man operating him was a performer named Danny Seagrin, not the man who'd eventually make the character famous. 4 years later, the same puppet turns up again, silent, chased around a stage by an amorous monster during a television special for a trumpet player named Herb Alpert. This time, a different pair of hands is inside him. Jim Henson himself, briefly, wordlessly, working a puppet that wouldn't get a real voice for another 2 years. 1976. Henson digs the same sad-eyed, bent-nosed puppet out of a box in New York and hands him to a 29-year-old industrial designer named Dave Goelz, along with 4 words. This could be Gonzo. Goelz had designed products for John Deere and Hewlett-Packard. He had almost no performing experience. He'd gotten into the room in the first place by watching Frank Oz through a telephoto lens like, in his own words, an assassin. 3 men, 3 completely different relationships to the same puppet, only the third one stayed. And staying, it turns out, was the hard part. The frightened one. Goelz was terrified, not nervous, terrified. Decades later, he still described it without softening it. I was very insecure because I really had no business being in the entertainment industry, he said. I had no training of any kind, except 2 little sessions with Jim and Frank, so I felt very unqualified. That fear went straight into the puppet. For the entirety of that first season, Goelz played Gonzo as what he later called this little, dark, frightened character, and it showed. The crew loved watching Henson and Oz work. When Goelz came on stage by his own account, he could hear the newspapers come up. People weren't just uninterested, they were actively looking somewhere else. And outside the studio, that same season, the show's opening titles were closing on nothing more than a single blunt gong strike. No note, no melody, just impact, then silence. You can watch the character on screen groping for a way to matter. In the very first episode of the series, Gonzo eats a rubber tire to the tune of Flight of the Bumblebee, gets booed off the stage, and calls the audience yokels on his way out. A few episodes later, Kermit corners him backstage and lays it out with more honesty than kindness. I have seen you eat a rubber tire to music, and I've seen you play a concert on your head with a mallet, and Gonzo, my dear friend, it doesn't work. Gonzo doesn't back down. He insists he's an artist. that he doesn't perform for the masses. It's the exact argument of someone who suspects deep down that he might be wrong and has decided to say it louder instead. Not long after, the mask cracks completely. Animal wrecks one of his acts, and Gonzo doesn't even try to defend himself. He just walks into guest star Lena Horne's dressing room and quietly bangs his head against her door. She notices him. She sings to comfort him. Nobody wrote that scene to sell records. It exists purely because the show, even this early, understood that this particular character was breakable. Here's where the story could have stayed forever. A sad, underused Muppet who never found his footing, quietly phased out by season 2. It happens to characters on other shows all the time. It didn't happen here, and the reason is a single word that almost didn't get said. One word? No. Late in that first season, according to Goelz's own account years later, the script called for Gonzo to shout one word. No, just no. Goelz couldn't manage it. Take after take, he'd produce a weak, embarrassed croak, and Henson kept pushing. Do it again, make it big. It went on by his telling for what felt like forever. Henson endlessly patient until something broke loose and Goelz just went for it. A full, over-emphatic, unmistakable no. The crew laughed. A real laugh. The first one Goelz had earned all season, and once he understood what that felt like, he rebuilt the puppet to match it, replacing Gonzo's permanently sad, fixed eyes with a mechanism that let them widen, narrow, actually react. As I got confidence, he got confidence, Goelz said of the character, like the two of them had been waiting on each other the entire time, which they had, finding a voice. Now watch what happens once that confidence exists, because the show's own opening titles quietly confirm it. Starting in season 2, the gong disappears. Gonzo is inside the O with an actual trumpet now actually trying to play a note. It rarely lands clean, but for the first time it's not just an impact, it's an attempt at music, and it happens the exact same year the character himself finally has something to say. By season 2, Gonzo isn't cowering anymore. He's auditioning chickens for a dancing act nobody asked for, and when the whole thing goes nowhere, he turns to an empty room and ad-libs 3 words that weren't in any script. Nice legs, though. That's the entire accidental birth of a decades-long romantic obsession with a chicken named Camilla, and it happened because a performer who'd once been too scared to say no was now confident enough to improvise a joke on live tape. A few episodes later, he proposes marriage to guest star Madeline Kahn after knowing her for approximately one afternoon, gets his heart broken almost immediately, and sits alone to sing about it. That's not a character being simplified into one joke. That's a character being trusted with an entire arc, start to finish, inside a single half hour. By the time George Burns shows up, something has shifted again. Gonzo isn't performing at a celebrity anymore, hoping to be noticed. He's swapping showbiz stories with one, like a peer. It's a small scene. It's also proof that the terrified kid from season 1 has quietly become someone comfortable enough to stand next to a legend without shrinking. Walking toward the explosion. Once fear stops being the default setting, the show starts handing him its most dangerous material. Guest star Dudley Moore's episode gives him a line that would end up quoted for decades. I shall now defuse this highly explosive bomb while simultaneously and at the same time reciting the works of Percy Bysshe Shelley. It's absurd. It's also the exact opposite of a character avoiding pain. This is a performer who spent season 1 flinching from an audience now building an entire identity around walking toward the explosion on purpose. By season 3, he's dating Camilla properly, an actual first date, jealous of a giant yellow bird who wanders through mid-serenade. It's silly, it's also stable in a way nothing about early Gonzo ever was. And near the end of the run, guest star Lola Falana's episode does something the writers hadn't dared attempt before. Gonzo quits, storms off after landing what he thinks is a movie deal, sings a genuinely tearful My Way on his way out the door, and Kermit doesn't play it for laughs. He just stands there with him. When the deal falls through and Gonzo comes back to face his own replacement, it isn't humiliation. It's a character secure enough to leave, fail loudly in public, and walk back in anyway. Guest star Paul Simon gets a version of that same security from the other direction. Gonzo idolizes him openly, tries songwriting to impress him, hands him a genuinely terrible original called For You. Simon, presumably out of mercy, destroys the guitar, and Gonzo survives it completely unbothered. That's not thick skin by accident, that's thick skin built one small humiliation at a time over years on camera. A species of one. But confidence never fully answers the one question this character started with. What exactly is Gonzo? Nobody, not the writers, not Henson, not Goelz himself, ever settled on an answer, and by the time the Muppets got their own science fiction movie in 1999, the show finally let him ask the question directly instead of joking around it. In Muppets from Space, Gonzo starts receiving messages in his breakfast cereal and becomes convinced he's an alien, separated from his real family, alone in a species of one. It plays as comedy. It's also the loneliest premise any Muppet has ever been handed, a 50-year-old identity crisis finally given a plot. He spends the entire film chasing the possibility that somewhere out there something else looks like him. By the end, he chooses to stay with the family he already has instead. The uncertainty about what he is never fully resolves. What resolves instead is who he trusts enough to stay with. Uncertainty and all. That's Gonzo's version of growing up, not an answer, a decision to stop needing one. The dog who went quiet. It's worth pausing here on another character shaped by absence for a very different reason. Rolf the dog, the show's resident piano player, was Jim Henson's own character, and by most accounts, the one closest to Henson's real personality. When Henson died in 1990, nobody recast Rolf. The Muppeteers simply stopped giving him lines. He appears silently playing piano in the background of The Muppet Christmas Carol 2 years later, and again in Muppet Treasure Island in 1996, present but wordless for 6 years out of what Brian Henson later called a mark of respect. It took until 1996 and a new performer named Bill Beretta for Rolf to speak again. That's a real gap, a real silence, but it isn't decline through neglect. It's closer to a held breath, deliberately paused rather than allowed to erode. And it's still not what happened to Gonzo. Gonzo never went silent, never got quietly written out of his own lines. Whatever changed about him changed while the same man kept showing up week after week with no gap to fill and no absence to explain. Believing the Weirdo. Which brings the story to where it actually settles in a film released 2 years after the man who'd first pulled a sad-eyed puppet out of a box had died. In The Muppet Christmas Carol, of every character available, the production handed the role of Charles Dickens himself, the narrator, the one telling the whole story, to Gonzo. He insists, completely straight-faced, that he really is Dickens. A rat by his side keeps calling him out on it. Nobody in the room argues that he doesn't belong there. Of course, the Weirdo tells the story. He's the only one on that stage who ever had to learn how to be believed in the first place. Go back one more time to that opening title sequence. Season 1, a single gong strike, blunt and uncertain. Every season after, a trumpet note, chaotic, often wrong, but reaching for something. Nobody flattened that character over 50 years. He just kept trying to play the note, take after take, until eventually, somehow, enough of them landed.